Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland, Scotland at 7. I'm Ruth Watson. My guest this evening is William Duguid, writer and activist based in Perth. Hello, William. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Here.
Well, before we come to our chat about the news of today, we'll go over the headlines first. UK inflation has risen above 10% for the first time in 40 years, driven by soaring prices for food and fuel as households come under mounting pressure from the cost of living crisis. New analysis by The Bottom Line quantifies the economic price that Scotland is paying for dependence on the UK economy. The UK is in long-term economic decline, it says, with the growth gap between the UK and other advanced economies widening in the last 2 decades. The Green Party in England and Wales has called for the permanent nationalisation of the energy supply companies and for domestic fuel bills to be reduced to the level of last autumn, describing this as a situation to the failed experiment with a market-based energy system. Following the Tory leadership hustings in Perth last night, the SNP's Deputy Westminster spokesperson, Kirsten Oswald MP, responded by saying, "This was depressing watching for Scots. Almost 2 hours of out-of-touch Tory ministers trying to out-Thatcher one another, denying Scots their democracy, and trashing the record of the same Tory government they've been a key part of." Survivors of the contaminated blood scandal have been awarded interim compensation payments after a 40-year battle, but thousands of parents and children of the victims have still received nothing. President Biden has signed into law his $430 billion bill that is seen as the biggest climate package in US history, designed to cut domestic greenhouse gas emissions as well as lower prescription drug prices and reduce high inflation. A Saudi student at Leeds University who had returned home to the kingdom for a holiday has been sentenced to 34 years in prison for having a Twitter account and for following and retweeting dissidents and activists. Changes to a shared equity scheme will mean disabled people, first-time buyers, and others on low to medium incomes will have an increased opportunity to buy a home that meets their needs. New funding has been announced to cut carbon emissions in homes and commercial properties as the Scottish Government continues to focus on delivering its net zero targets and support families with the cost of living. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and Zero Carbon Buildings Minister Patrick Harvey announced £16.2 million in funding for 5 zero-emission heat networks during a visit to homes in Glasgow. So, that's enough of the news for just now. Let's get back to the stories of today and discuss them with William Duguid. Good evening, William. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you very much. I'm just back from last night being at the outside the Conservative leadership hustings in Perth, so that's all good fun.
Well, as we look at some of the main issues for the day, just a quick, seeing as you were there, what did you think of yesterday's Tory minister hustings that was happening in Perth?
Well, all of these hustings are, to my mind, a bit of a charade, and it illustrate the extent to which the majority of the population, and in particular in this case Scotland, are locked out of these discussions, and how we're being discussed without having a voice in the room. So that side of it, no different. The protest was interesting, and you may come to that. And yes, that had its moments, and certainly some feisty moments. And the Tories and others have made quite a lot of capital on that. So that was an interesting one, and probably more complex than it at first appears. But that's democracy for you.
Well, going to a country that's fighting for its democracy, a Ukraine update. Day 174 of the war that the Russians have imposed on Ukraine. Russian military leaders are likely to be increasingly concerned about security in Crimea after reported explosions, a UK intelligence update has said. The Ministry of Defense has said both Russian and Ukrainian authorities admitted that an ammunition dump exploded on Tuesday near Dzonsky in the north of the region and that a nearby railway and substation were also damaged. In the Donetsk region at the forefront of the Russian offensive, 2 civilians were killed and 7 others were wounded by recent Russian shelling of several towns and villages. A recreation centre has been destroyed and 3 people injured after Russian shelling in Odessa, Sergei Bratchuk, a representative of the Odessa military administration, has said. The mayor of Lviv, Andrei Sadovsky, has warned residents in the western city to prepare for a tough winter in a video posted to his social media accounts. There could be more attacks in the next 2 or 3 months, similar to the strikes in Crimea. Ukraine is engaged in a counter-offensive aimed at creating chaos within Russian forces by striking at the invader supply lines deep into occupied territories, a Ukrainian spokesperson has said. The leaders of Ukraine, Turkey and the UN are set to meet to review the grain export deal in Lviv on Thursday. Energoatom, Ukraine's nuclear operator, reported what is called an unprecedented cyber attack on its website. It said its operations had not been disrupted. Russia's defense ministry has warned the UK against a planned spy plane flight over Russian territory, saying its air force has been given orders to prevent an intrusion. The ministry said the UK sent a notice informing about a planned flight of an RC-135 reconnaissance plane along a route that partly passes over Russian territory. As an editorial aside, I'm not quite sure how that could be a spy plane flight if it's not secret, but there you go. Estonian authorities removed a Soviet-era tank from its pedestal in the eastern city of Narva, the most significant removal yet of an estimated 200 to 400 such monuments that the government has pledged to take down by the end of the year. This week, Estonia will close its border to more than 50,000 Russians with previously issued visas. Finland says it will cut the number of visas it issues to Russians to 10% of current volumes from the 1st of September, after Russian tourists began using the country as a gateway to European holiday destinations. As the Ukrainian crisis, the Russian-imposed crisis on Ukraine sort of falls from the news cycle, how important do you think it is, William, that we keep talking about the issue, and what sort of awareness do you think there are among the people that you speak to of the continued plight and the continued impact that the war has, both in Ukrainians and the rest of the world?
Well, for some of the people I speak to, they're involved with actually helping Ukrainian refugees, so it remains very much a live issue for them. I do think always with the constant broadcasting of any one story, there is a news fatigue that sets in, and that is undoubtedly setting in the case of the Ukraine crisis. There are some good things that I think people are noticing, which is some grain finally getting out in small amounts, but at least it's a start. And we're only starting to understand the effect of the Ukraine war on so many other things, such as the price of fuel, but also the food shortages in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere, and the overall effect on the world economy. So it's one that will keep coming back into the headlines, but it's sometimes as easy just to forget it in the sort of glare of other things.
Do you think that there's any greater understanding now about the importance of, for example, safe passage and safe routes for refugees? Are you getting any inkling that perhaps the fairly endless hostile rhetoric around refugees who do not, look as though they are ethnically European? Do you think that that is something which is impacting people? I know that here in where I live, there are people who are saying, you know what, we want Ukrainian refugees to come here. Isn't it terrible what they're going through? And it really makes you think, for example, about those Syrians, or So, are you getting any sense that perhaps people, through watching what's happening in Ukraine, are beginning to understand why people come from the Middle East and from Africa?
I wish they were, but I'm not entirely sure that that's the case. as a species, we seem to be able to separate out different sorts of people quite without having to think too hard about it. I, we're still hearing the rhetoric occasionally from supporters of Priti Patel about boats in the Channel. And, you know, the answer to this question is to provide safe passage for all refugees and to have a joined up refugee policy here in the UK and to accept refugees in the same sort of numbers as other countries are already doing. But I do think that too often the political rhetoric is still dominated by xenophobia. And yeah, we can be quite hypocritical about it.
I came across the first refugees, Ukrainian refugees, in my wee town the other day, and I was really impressed that one of the people I was speaking to said, "Oh, I can't talk for very long because I've just finished the night shift and I'm pretty tired." And the gentleman'd only been here for a few weeks, and has already managed to find work. And of course, there are a lot of jobs going now that Brexit means there aren't European workers coming over here in such numbers as before. What do you think we can do to welcome refugees without overwhelming them?
It's a tricky one because the temptation, if you're in the business of welcoming refugees, is to throw all your resources at them. But the thing to remember is, in terms of them having work here, which is good, what actually most of them would really want is to go back home and for it to be peaceful there. And so one would hope that it doesn't become the case that what is a temporary refuge has to become a permanent home. And we always have to bear in mind that their desire is to go back and to be thinking in terms of facilitating that when the time comes, and maybe facilitating a situation where they can. Also, I think it's important to remember that all of them have been through pretty severe trauma, and it's very difficult to get inside the head of somebody who's been in that situation. But we need to be alive to it because, there's a lot of adrenaline keeps you going in the short term. But if something becomes a long term thing, you really have to think about the welfare of the person. So it's a complex issue.
There's an author I sometimes see on Twitter, Professor Lucy Easthope, who's written a book called When the Dust Settles, which is about sort of post-traumatic realities for people who have gone through that kind of trauma. So I don't know, perhaps it's one of those things people will become more conversant with as we go on. Looking at the UK inflation rates, UK inflation has risen above 10% for the first time in 40 years, driven by soaring prices for food and fuel as households come under mounting pressure from the cost of living crisis. The Office for National Statistics said the Consumer Prices Index rose by 10.1% in the year to July, up from a reading of 9.4% in June, and entering double figures at an earlier stage than anticipated. The figure was last higher in February 1982. It is only the fourth time in 70 years that inflation has breached the 10% threshold, the other periods being 1951 to 52, 1973 to 77, and 1979 to 1982. The reading exceeded the 9.8% forecast from city economists as the cost of food and drink rose at the highest rate since 2008 amid a broad-based inflationary burst across the economy. The biggest increases come for bread and cereals, dairy, meat, and vegetables, with the rising cost of food leading to record increases for restaurant and hotel prices and pushing up the cost of takeaways. Price rises for other staple items such as pet food, toilet rolls, toothbrushes, and deodorants also sent inflation soaring. Commenting, the Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewlis MP said, "It is utterly shameful that the Tory government is nowhere to be seen while families are worried sick about rising bills and inflation is soaring to levels not seen since Margaret Thatcher. People need help right now. The Prime Minister and Chancellor must come out of hiding, recall Parliament, and introduce an emergency budget that freezes the energy price cap, scraps VAT on fuel, and delivers meaningful financial support for households." William, this is one of these questions, issues which, when I speak to people, they cannot believe that a so-called conservative government is acting in such a sort of, I mean, the Conservative Party government, they very much seem to almost have taken conservative out of the Tory. You know what I mean? It's kind of
Not doing
the
any
normal Conservative.
conserving, are they?
Yeah, you know what I mean? I mean, what is going on with that? So when you look at inflation rates and also actually looking back through history at some of the social ramifications that come after that, what's your overall view on what society will look like? And have you any views on why it is that the party of government is not taking any action to help people? What is the end game here? What's the end play for the Tory party?
I don't think they know what to do. I, the normal levers that you would use to deal with an inflationary crisis don't necessarily apply when your inflationary crisis is imposed from outside by um, world events and by other things. Um, so they're really struggling to know how to deal with it. The other aspect of it in recent months has been the decline in sterling, which is also pushing up prices in various ways. And I think that the two candidates for the prime ministership are desperately doggy paddling, trying to find something that's going to work and then retracting it when it turns out to be slightly embarrassing or doesn't work. This needs a fundamental think about. I mean, emergency budget is one thing, but a fundamental think about how we bail out the economy, because the whole thing could get in desperate trouble. And people, and also not thought about much, are businesses. There's not much point in bailing out households if the businesses for which their household members all work collapse. So there's a lot of work needing done, and it would be nice if it were being done by experienced and clearly competent politicians. But I'm afraid that's what we don't have at the moment.
So the Tories have been in power for the last 12 years, and when you hear the current candidates for the leadership talking, they're going to be really cross when they find out who's been in government for the last 12 years. You know, there seems to be a remarkable abdication of responsibility. It is very hard. I find it hard because I'm not an economist. I find it very hard as a sort of political and social commentator to try and separate out the strands, because we've got the impact of Brexit, which is was always forecast to be appalling, and that now seems to be coming to bear. Sort of, the Financial Times and others are quite good at saying this is probably Brexit, this is probably COVID, this is probably the war in Ukraine, and this is the whole Clem-Jamfrey in together. Boris Johnson has quite long been called the lucky prime minister because he sort of had COVID and other awful events to kind of obscure how appalling Brexit is. At what point do you think the luck runs out for the Tory party and the light is shone in them as very much being the ones who are, sort of holding the axe beside the sinking boat?
That could happen this winter, maybe sooner than we think. Uh, Particularly once the cost of living crisis really hits people, which it hasn't. Well, it has to a great extent with some folks, but it's going to become much more widespread. And there is a lot of anger against the Tories out there, not just in Scotland, by no means. I think it could get very ugly indeed unless something constructive happens to maybe alleviate the problems.
I was hearing earlier today that some of the schools in England might go down to a 3-day week because they aren't protected from the heating costs. And that, of course, then raises the issue of, well, what about hospitals? I mean, what will happen to hospital fuel bills and hospital budgets? It's actually quite a scary time ahead. So, new analysis by the bottom line quantifies the economic price that Scotland is paying for dependence on the UK economy. The new organisation, the bottom line, is in long-term economic decline, with the growth gap between the UK and other advanced economies widening in the last 2 decades. The analysis from the bottom line shows that the economic growth gap between the UK and the small advanced economy group is particularly large, with all of the small advanced economies experiencing growth greater than the UK in the last 2 decades. On average, the small advanced economies experienced cumulative economic growth that was double that of the UK between 1999 and 2019, while gross domestic product is not the only measure of the economy that matters, it does indicate differences in material living standards. By 2019, the gap between UK GDP per capita and the small advanced economies average had increased to more than $16,200. That's £12,700 per person. As the Post concludes, the UK is in long-term relative economic decline, falling further and further behind countries of a similar size and stage of development as Scotland. The choice that Scotland faces is to remain part of the declining UK economy or to realise agency and take responsibility for improving the performance of the Scottish economy. Roger Mullen, for the Bottom Line, will be joining us on Scotland at 7 this Friday to discuss the analysis in more depth. But in the meantime, William, when you look at the strategy that the First Minister and the Scottish Government have when they're promoting the agenda for the thesis for an independent Scotland, they very much seem to be framing the narrative around look at other countries the same size as Scotland and within Europe and how they are doing. How do you think that works as a sort of tactic or a philosophy? Do you think that that's something which people are engaging with?
I think if you're looking at a strategy of releasing a steady stream of papers, it's a good setting of the ground for what's coming next. And of course, the comparison with smaller sized countries is particularly relevant in the case of Scotland. It was interesting that, the extent to which their first paper that they brought out was rubbished on the basis of individual countries. Scotland doesn't want to be like that because they also have X, which is bad. But that isn't the point. The point is we are doing badly relative to other countries, and Scotland would have the agility, it is said, to do better. And that's the real point. Now, there is then the onus on the Scottish Government to produce the rest of the items that they're going to produce that back that up and show how that will be done. And it's an interesting strategy overall, releasing them one by one, in the idea that you don't give your opponents a single target to hit, but that you're always coming at them with something else. We'll see how that works. I quite like it, actually. It means I don't have a large doorstep that I'm going to get posted to me like Scotland's future was.
So, how likely do you think it is then that these sort of bite-sized chunks um, are being looked at and absorbed by folk across wider society? And how easy do you think it makes it for activists like yourself to come up with sort of like easily digestible slivers of information for people who are interested in discussing the issue, the constitutional issue? How useful do you think that is as a strategy for activists?
Well, if you have an idea of what's coming out when, then you can certainly react to it. Obviously, you're getting various details from various sources. The Scottish Government is one. Believe in Scotland is another one that certainly we and many other groups use. So it's, I think it allows you to focus on various issues at various times, as long as you're focusing on the key issues and you have a digestible enough set of information for your own activists to be aware of what's in there, and also to be able to, if you like, synthesize it into bullet-sized, bite-sized points that you can put across, and then have the background information once you get asked the inevitable questions. I think I prefer it to the way we did things in 2014, but it's early days.
You have a very active group in Perth, and you've got a very lovely shop, the Destiny shop, in the middle of Perth, where people can come in and discuss issues about independence or get resources. What sort of advice or ideas do you have, or have you found from within your group that you think might be perhaps of use to other groups or other activists? I mean, and I know that there's several of the Bletherins or Yes hubs that are actually finding it quite tough going because with the cost of living crisis, they're having a hard time keeping the lights on in their hubs. I mean, what do you think the Yes movement can do or could do or should do to try and support these premises?
It's a difficult thing, actually. I mean, the electricity costs, ours have just gone up by a considerable margin, but I was actually relieved because it wasn't quite so much. So I can see how the Bletherins and others would be having issues. I think we have to, this is like, we have to keep at it, and we have to keep educating ourselves, and we have to be aware of what's happening in the outer world with the people who are coming in and the way they're feeling about things. Their mood is going to change very soon. Needn't necessarily be to our advantage. We have to be aware and sensitive to what they feel, but also what our volunteers are also feeling. This is uncharted territory. So we're actually, I mean, we have a great group of volunteers, and we're very lucky in that. And we also have a diverse group in terms of their political outlook. Not everybody has that. And that gives us a sort of degree of robustness that some groups may not have. But nothing can be taken for granted. We really are making this up as we go along to an extent. We're doing it very creatively, don't get me wrong, but everything is new.
So I guess that perhaps is the story of Scotland all the way along, isn't it? Nothing stays the same for long. Looking at change in England and Wales, the Green Party in England and Wales has called for the permanent renationalisation of the main energy supply companies and for domestic fuel bills to be reduced to the level of last autumn, describing this as a solution for the failed experiment with a market-based energy system. In a proposal that goes well beyond Labour's idea for a freeze on energy bills for at least 6 months, the Greens said nationalising the main five energy firms was a necessary part of a plan sufficiently ambitious to avoid a catastrophe this winter. The scheme would be based on the one proposed by the Trade Union Congress last month. This was based on the cost of about 2.85 billion pounds to nationalise the five big supply firms: British Gas, E.ON, EDF, Scottish Power, and OVO. As a comparison, the Westminster government spent £2.2 billion bailing out another firm, Bulb. The England and Wales Green plans would also involve the energy price cap, the maximum households can pay, being put back to the level of last autumn, before this April's increase of nearly £700 a year for the average household. Putting this in place throughout the autumn and winter would cost about £37 billion, the party said, compared with the £29 billion estimated cost of Labour's proposal to keep the cap at its current level. The cost would be paid for in part by tightening up the government's windfall tax on oil and gas firms' extra profits from higher global prices, and the party also proposes higher taxes for very wealthy people. Carla Denyer, a co-leader of the England and Wales Greens alongside Adrian Ramsay, said the party would also aim to create a more energy efficiency by introducing differential tariffs under which households that use a lot of power face proportionally rising prices, with exceptions for people with disabilities or chronic health conditions. The party is already committed to a mass programme of home insulation to improve energy efficiency. So when you hear a story like that, William, how much does it make you wish we had a nationalised Scottish energy firm? And what do you think the future holds for energy in Scotland? I mean, of course, there is the issue that not all of the energy providers in Scotland Scottish Government can have anything really to do with. And I am aware that the Scottish Government at the time said that because of the way in which the energy and the sort of the network was structured, it wouldn't have been economically feasible to set out a nationalised power company before Scottish independence. So what do you think about the way in which energy should be approached within Scotland, and what do you think of this suggestion from the Greens?
Um, well, I think I really do agree, actually, that properly sorting out energy in Scotland does require independence. Um, I understand the difficulties with the National Energy Company, but I wish they hadn't dangled it at us and then said, "Oh well, we can't really," because that's not actually a good look. If you're talking about doing something radical and then well, actually we're not able to. So I think I do see nationalisation as almost inevitable as things are currently going. But it just takes, how long does it take to recognise it? Within an independent Scotland, we just need to hive off our bit of the grid and, crucially, use the renewable power that we've got to reduce the cost of energy, hopefully permanently. The reliance on gas is crazy anyway, and we don't have to rely on gas. At the moment, the UK, maybe it does, because it really isn't all that interested in renewables, certainly not in England, and it's actually setting its hat more at nuclear power, which, okay, maybe if gas has gone up, it's not relatively so expensive, but it is a very expensive and has lots of downsides. So I think UK policy is currently pretty confused. I think Scotland's policy could be much more agile and better for the long term. I just hope we get to see it, because I don't think we get it before independence.
It's remarkable to hear both of the Tory leader candidates talking about their philosophy on energy, because as somebody who spends a lot of time trying to work out what people are saying, so I can convey that, to relay that to the rest of the world, or those who will listen to me, it seems like a pretty confused policy that they have. And I don't understand. I mean, in all seriousness, I don't understand how it is that we are in a situation where diesel sort of diesel's sort of as cheap as it was to buy for, if you're an oil and gas company, sort of as it was in 2008. There was a spike when Putin invaded Ukraine, but then the price has come down of a barrel. So I don't understand why it's still so high, and I don't understand why France is able to cap the price of energy from the people that own EDF are at 4%, and yet we're facing soaring prices, and the Westminster government seems unable to do anything. I genuinely don't understand it. Do you have any theories?
I don't have any theories that necessarily hold water. France was able to cap it because I think they had a couple of increases before they capped it, but they then fully nationalised EDF, and they will be absorbing any losses that are made as a result of the continuing high prices at source. And that is actually something that, under nationalisation, any government would have to do until they could find a way of fixing it. I forgot to mention the Greens. I think that the Greens is an admirable policy, but it's like everything, it's a short-term policy, just as Labour's was a short-term policy. At least those parties have policies, and the Lib Dems, I should mention them as well. They were capping at the current rate as well. The good thing about the Green policy, by the way, is that it would cut prices again, because what's not always recognised is that the current prices on an ongoing basis are also unsustainable. Okay, it's going to get higher, but right now, for many people, it's unsustainable. So that's a good thing. But what happens beyond the 6 months? How much does it cost beyond the 6 months? And how big a helping hand are you going to have to give to get this straight? I think we are going to end up basically printing money. The Bank of England creating the money, just as they had to do for COVID, just as they had to do in another way at the time of bailing out the banks. Okay, that went in maybe the wrong hands. Maybe this will be a popular bailout. Richard Murphy put together a few ideas in a paper this week and was talking in terms of it costing roughly 144 billion to sort this out. And the best way to do it, okay, you can tax if you like, but you can't necessarily keep taxing, but you can create the money. And I think that may be the best way out of it. But how long will it take our lords and masters to think of it?
How sustainable is it for these power companies, the fuel companies, to keep cheering about these record profits? I mean, sort of somebody saying, well, we're just having to cart it away in wheelbarrows because we've got so much money. Sorry, plebs. I mean, I, from an economic and a political point of view, it seems like a really weird strategy that the Conservative Party is prepared to go with. I keep trying to work out, what's in it. I mean, I can't imagine that it's all down to Rishi Sunak's wife, but it's kind of you, why it just doesn't make any sense to me that a government would be so prepared to bankrupt a nation of people.
I don't think they realise that's what their current line of thinking is going to do. I honestly don't think they've joined up the dots. That may seem absurd, but Richard Murphy will certainly tell you, I don't think people have bought into it. This includes politicians. I don't think people have bought into the seriousness of this. We are looking potentially at the collapse of the economy, full stop, if something isn't done
Completely. I mean,
about
yeah,
this.
I was speaking to some farming leaders just last week, and when they take it down to step by step to a granular level, you're talking about not only the farmer being unable to, run the tractor, but the person, the haulier, being unable to take the produce from the farm to the shop being able to unable to afford to keep the lights on, the restaurants and those people who put food in a secondary way onto our shelves being unable to sustain their businesses, the people that they employ being unable then to afford to buy the food, and the food being severely reduced because, apart from anything else, we've got less on the shelves because of Brexit, and because farmers are having to literally plough good crops into the ground because they don't have people to pick it. So even looking at it from a food and drink point of view, it's I'm seriously concerned about the impact on food security and people being able to keep food on the plates.
I agree. I'm waiting for something to happen. I don't know when.
Well, our lords and masters, as you've put it, the Tory leadership hustings in Perth, as we touched on earlier. Following the Tory leadership hustings in Perth last night, the SNP's Deputy Westminster spokesperson, Kirsten Oswald MP, responded by saying, "This was depressing watching for Scots. Almost 2 hours of two out-of-touch Tory ministers trying to out-Thatcher one another, denying Scots their democracy and trashing the record of the same Tory government they've been a key part of." Kirsten Oswald questioned whether Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss had a clue what ordinary folk are facing during this cost of living crisis, or whether they had any plans to support them. Ms Oswald said, "They have spent their time in the Tory government making the rich richer and the poor poorer. Sunak wants to take from the poor to give to the rich, and Truss thinks the solution to all problems is for British workers just to graft more. The options for the next UK Prime Minister are truly grim." Both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss were criticised for telling Scots what they say Scotland should have, and ignoring the Scottish Government's democratic mandate for an independence referendum. The East Renfrewshire MP said, "Scotland has made it clear what it does and doesn't want by repeatedly rejecting the Tories at the polls and repeatedly voting for independent-supported parties." Adding, "Scotland hasn't voted for the Tories since the 1950s, yet we keep getting saddled with Tory governments and prime ministers. We were told in 2014 that Scotland's place in the EU would only be safe if we rejected independence. That was a lie. It's time Scotland had a say on its future, and it's clear that whoever wins this gruesome Tory contest will only increase support for independence," Ms Oswald concluded. At a demonstration outside the event in Perth, the protests attracted negative publicity in the media and from politicians after a video of a small group of protesters shared a video of them noisily abusing BBC journalist James Cook. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon tweeted, "Hurling abuse at journalists is never acceptable. Their job is vital to our democracy, and it is to report and to scrutinise, not support any viewpoint." The First Minister said that life was too short to tune in for the live Conservative leadership hustings. Well, it certainly was 2 hours of my life I'll never get back. Um, what was your main takeaway from the debate? I did see one legal Twitter, a Scottish Twitter, commenting on Liz Truss's statement, saying that the UK was a family and she was never going to let that family split up. And this legal tutor was saying that it was never a good look when one half of a marriage was refusing the divorce and telling the partner that wanted to leave that they couldn't leave no matter how much they tried. What was your view on the evening's debate?
I'm not sure family analogies are always the best things, because families can be toxic things just the same as everything else. Um, I think it's still getting the applause from the Tory faithful, even the Scottish Tory faithful. And I have to say that the form, I mean, I took part in this process, so I've got to be a wee bit careful what I say here, but the form of the protest being so haranguingly negative, and I have to say this is not the independence movement saying this because all under one banner pulled out of the debate. I was actually the only pro-independence, overtly pro-independence speaker at the protest. But the haranguing I can completely understand because people are very, very angry at the moment. But it just doesn't help because it means that where you might want Tories to be thinking, well, are we really happy with this? Are we really happy with this choice? Are we really happy with Scotland being disrespected like this? But when they face that sort of barrage, they just double down, and that's what happened. So you know, we learn and we build from that.
There has been talk for several years about there being a sort of an informal code of conduct that yesers might perhaps consider adhering to or thinking about, and that the individual idea was taken with the support of the person who came up with the idea uh, by Aberdeen Independence Movement, and they came up with a code of conduct which they suggested yes groups could consider adhering to. Is that something that you think is worth wider consideration? I understand that there are some groups that didn't like the idea of that because they said it was sort of too prescriptive or whatever, but surely it's better to have a code of conduct than people perhaps alienating soft no's.
Um, to a certain extent, everybody needs to adhere to their own code of conduct and to think about what their conduct should be. There is a danger of looking too prescriptive and particularly looking at narrowing the level of debate. But to a certain extent, how we conduct the independence debate is common sense. We don't want to alienate soft nose. We absolutely don't. We want to listen to them and we don't want to harangue them. Um, the hard ones, the answer is the hard nose, we just walk away because we will not convince them. And therefore, we target who we speak to and we speak to them respectively and respectfully, I should say. And crucially, we listen to them. Now, that's basically what the code of conduct says be respectful. It's common sense. I think too many people have got slightly hung up about the AIM code of conduct because it appeared it was being imposed from above. But you know, you don't need to harp on about the code of conduct. Just say, be respectful, and that will see you through.
I've certainly heard of Conservative Party members who are part of yes groups. So it's I'm very aware that there is a great diversity within the constitutional debate. People who would like to have an ethical right of centre party in an independent Scotland. So I guess it's quite hard, perhaps, for some people who are feeling frustrated at the cost of living crisis imposed by a Conservative Party to 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 reflect upon the way in which their actions might affect the wider movement. Survivors of the contaminated blood scandal have been awarded interim compensation payments after a 40-year battle, but thousands of parents and children of the victim have still received nothing. UK government ministers have accepted the urgency of the need to make the £100,000 payments to about 3,000 surviving victims, after being warned that those mistakenly infected with HIV and hepatitis C were dying at the rate of one every 4 days. But parents and children of the victims accused the UK government of perpetuating the scandal by failing to recognise their own trauma and loss in today's announcement. Contaminated blood products administered in the 1970s and 1980s to up to 6,000 people have already led to the deaths of more than 2,400 people in the biggest treatment scandal in NHS history. The UK government said it intends to make payments to those who have been infected and bereaved partners in England by the end of October. The same payments will be made in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. It's quite difficult, I think, for people of the younger generation to understand just what a huge scandal this was, and how much it changed things like the blood transfusion centre, the screening that they did. How important do you think it is that governments address the wrongdoings and give compensation. Is financial compensation always the answer, or sometimes is it an apology that's needed as well as financial help, perhaps?
An apology apology is always good, but financial compensation is really the only way that a government can show contrition. I would say that always, and certainly in this case, it's taken too long. And I'm glad that we've now got interim payments. I think they need to include the families of those who were affected as well, and I don't think it does yet. And we still don't know how long it'll be before the final payment. But it's a positive step, and that's important.
President Biden has signed into law his $430 billion bill that is seen as the biggest climate package in US history, designed to cut domestic greenhouse gas emissions as well as lower prescription drug prices and high inflation. At a White House event, President Biden was joined by Democratic leaders, including Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, whose support was crucial to passage out of the Inflation Reduction Act along party lines, after he blockaded much larger measures pushed by the White House. President Biden used a sign-in to criticize Republicans. Democrats hope to capitalize on a string of legislative victories in congressional midterm elections in November and roll out Inflation Act ad campaigns. The legislation to fight climate change and lower prescription drug prices aims to cut domestic greenhouse gas emissions. It will also allow Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices for the elderly and ensure that corporations and the wealthy pay the taxes they owe. Democrats say it will help combat inflation by reducing the federal deficit. Rating agencies and independent economists agree, but say the results will take years. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who was also present at the bill signing, said Biden knew when to stay away from the negotiations and allow them to play out. It's often said that American politics sends a shadow across the Atlantic to the UK, and there's often been a comparison made that perhaps Johnson is a sort of pound shop Trump. Um, Watching Nigel Farage and his comments about Donald Trump being sort of investigated by the FBI, and looking at American politics coming up to the midterms with, for example, the rollback of Roe v. Wade, something which perhaps it is hinted that perhaps the Conservative Party are looking at something similar with the removal of a woman's bodily autonomy within the Human Rights Act. How important do you think Biden's success in the midterm elections is, not just to politics in America, but perhaps to politics over here as well?
Well, certainly it's important for the politics of America, because if he's not successful in the mid-elections, he basically becomes a lame duck. And clearly, they've been looking for some big wins in what they've been announcing, and this is one of them. It's a slightly grandiose thing. It seems to be the kitchen sink being thrown at things, and interesting, they call it the Inflation Reduction Act, because that's the one thing you can't probably guarantee to do without doing other things. I think if America is serious about climate change, particularly about climate change, then that does make a difference. I remain to be convinced whether America is and will remain serious, but hopefully it will be, and it will jolly us along a little bit on this side of the Atlantic.
How important do you think, or how big do you think is the gulf between the awareness of the climate emergency, sort of between ordinary people and the elected representatives? I mean, we often hear it said that this year, this super hot year that we've had, is going to be the coolest summer that we will experience for the next 20 years of our lives, or 30 years or more, if we don't get a handle on the climate emergency. How seriously
I,
do you think? Sorry, how seriously do you think that politicians are taking that, and how much response or how much push do you think there is from the public?
I think there'll be increasing push from the public, because the public are starting to feel the effects. Actually, the public is ahead of the politicians. We had COP26, and then we had a war in Europe, and that's all that you need to know, really. That threw us back on reliance on, what would you know, fossil fuels. I think the politicians really do need to wake up and drop the short-termism right now. And I think in this increasingly complex world, the people will be trying to force them to do so. how they react is going to be very interesting.
Well, let's keep an eye on the midterms and see how we go, at least with the American
Woohoo!
side of things. That may well give us an indication of what's coming. A Saudi student at Leeds University who had returned home to the kingdom for a holiday has been sentenced to 34 years in prison for having a Twitter account and for following and retweeting dissidents and activists. Salma al-Shahab, 34, a mother of 2 young children, returned home to Saudi Arabia in December 2020 on a holiday and had intended to bring her 2 children and husband back to the UK with her. She was then called in for questioning by Saudi authorities and eventually arrested and tried for her tweets. She was initially sentenced to serve 3 years in prison for the crime of using an internet website to cause public unrest and destabilise civil and national security. But an appeals court on Monday handed down the new sentence, 34 years in prison, followed by a 34-year travel ban after a public prosecutor asked the court to consider other alleged crimes. According to a translation of the court records, the new charges include the allegation that Shahab was assisting those who seek to cause public unrest and destabilise civil and national security by following their Twitter accounts and by retweeting their tweets. It is believed that Shahab may still be able to seek a new appeal in the case. The sentencing by Saudi's Special Terrorist Court was handed down weeks after the US President Joe Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia, which human rights activists had warned could embolden the kingdom to escalate its crackdown on dissidents and other pro-democracy activists. The case also marks the latest example of how the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has targeted Twitter users in his campaign of repression while simultaneously controlling a major indirect stake in the UK's social media company through Saudi's sovereign wealth fund, the Public Investment Fund, PIF. This is pretty alarming stuff, isn't it? I mean, the new Crown Prince seems to be increasingly and openly repressive. I mean, first he sort of, his hands are covered in the blood of Khashoggi, who was murdered in an embassy, and yet the West continues to do business with him because everybody wants his lovely oil. What happens to democracy and the increase of Wahhabism, the increase of the influence of the Saudis across the Middle East, um, as we sort of wring our hands and continue to sell them weapons? What do you think the way ahead is?
The way ahead is for us to stop doing what we're doing. Undoubtedly, Mohammed bin Salman has been emboldened by Biden arriving with his fist pump. I hear there are calls for Biden to speak out now, but the cat's out of the bag. We are too enslaved to the idea of oil and money. And for all sorts of reasons, that needs to stop. Democracy is in a pretty fragile state in many corners of the world, not least Saudi Arabia. But yes, this is very, very alarming. These guys at the top of that country are effectively murderers, state-sanctioned murder. And we shouldn't countenance it for a moment. There should be a pariah state, as indeed, I think, might have been Biden's campaign vow, he said, checking his notes.
Do you think that there are shades of other famous people who have been locked up overseas on fairly trumped up charges? Is it possible that perhaps there's a payment Westminster hasn't made to Saudi Arabia? Is there something else going on here, or do you think that they're just trying to send a message to crack down on dissent?
They're sending a message, and they're using a woman to do it, and that's always an easy target.
And
Yeah, it was a quick one.
while we look at Saudi Arabia as Saudi Arabia and others as being repressive regimes, we can't lose sight of the fact that Rishi Sunak just last week was talking about sending dissenters for re-education in this country. I mean, do you think that we ourselves face the possibility of repressive laws being brought in? Sort of the thought of Rishi Sunak wanting to re-educate people who campaign against Britain surely is something that should alarm anybody who wants to have free speech and express democracy within these isles.
In a word, yes. The direction of travel of the UK government is to squeeze freedom, and that will be increasingly freedom of speech. And yeah, There are many, many dangers here, and we need to recognize them and resist them as soon as we possibly can.
How alive to the risks do you think people are?
Not at all.
And
Until it
what can we
affects
do to
them,
try?
not at all. What can we do? We can shout it from the rooftops, and we can shout it from our Twitter accounts while we still have them. Some people are doing.
There you go. Yes, get tweeting. Um, Changes to a shared equity scheme will mean disabled people, first-time buyers, and others on low to medium incomes will have an increased opportunity to buy a home that meets their needs. From today, the threshold of the open market shared equity scheme, which allows people to buy a home without having to fund its entire cost, has been raised by 9% across the country to reflect rising house prices. The scheme is aimed at priority groups who need support to buy their own home. Applicants will also be able to make offers on properties above the formal valuation amount where they have funds available. People who have an application in progress do not need to reapply to benefit from the changes. The OMSE scheme is available across Scotland. It's open to first-time buyers and these priority access groups, people aged 60 and over, social renters, that's people who rent from the council or a housing association, disabled people, members of the armed forces, veterans who have left the armed forces within the past 2 years, widows, widowers, and other partners of service personnel for up to 2 years after their partner has lost their life while serving. This obviously is very good news for people who want to get onto the housing ladder, but how much does this speak of wider problems to do with housing and a housing market which perhaps has become skewed in favour of I don't know, Airbnb and sort of second home owners and houses as investment rather than homes? How much does this address that?
It addresses it as best we probably can in the current economic environment, in the current Westminster purse strings environment. We really need to look at huge scale investment in affordable housing. And this is good, but we can do better. And we need to keep pressing home the message we can do better.
Well, new funding has been announced to cut carbon emissions in homes and commercial properties as the Scottish Government continues to focus on delivering its net zero targets and support families with the cost of living. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and the Zero Carbons Building Minister Patrick Harvey announced £16.2 million of funding for 5 zero emission heat networks during a visit to homes in Glasgow. The announcement coincides with the first anniversary of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Green Parliamentary Group signing the Butte House Agreement, a plan to work together to build a green economic recovery from COVID, respond to the climate emergency, and create a fairer country. In its first year, the agreement has delivered a range of benefits for households, communities, and businesses, and seen work begin on a number of longer-term reforms. Particular progress has been made across a range of areas, including doubling the Scottish Child Payment to £20 per week per eligible child from April 2022, with plans to extend eligibility to under 16s and further increasing the payment to £25 per week by the end of 2022. Bringing ScotRail into public ownership, introducing free bus travel for under 22s to cut the cost of living for young people, encourage sustainable travel behaviours early in their lives, and improve access to education, leisure, and work. Investing a record £150 million in active travel in 2022 to 23, including more than doubling the funding for the National Cycle Network, and publishing Scotland's National Strategy for Economic Transformation, setting out Scotland will transition to a well-being economy. How useful are these policies, and how well do you think they will go towards giving people confidence that the Scottish Government has got a plan while we're all faced with this cost of living crisis that's been imposed on us from Westminster?
Well, the cost of living crisis is a big one, but actually, I had not realised so much had been done in that first year. So I applaud that. And we actually need to be shouting at it because it is evidence of competence within the Scottish Government that we don't see elsewhere. So let keep it up, and let's the rest of us keep it out so people understand what's going on.
Well, you heard it here on Broadcasting Scotland. Lots of good news, and get tweeting, folks. That's the Duguid message. Let's get the message out there
Oh
across
yes.
social media. um, well, as we come towards 7 o'clock, That's it for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcast Scotland supporter. And if you've always fancied getting involved in television or reporting or broadcasting, please do get in touch. We're always on the lookout for volunteers, and you could find yourself in the hot seat presenting this programme. If you so like, training will be given. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes, and those staff will be paid the living wage. I'm Ruth Watson. Thank you very much for my guest, William Duguid. Good night to you, and thank you for watching.